My name is Jay Shambaugh. I'm the co-director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP, here at GW. We at IIEP are very pleased to be hosting this event in our Envisioning India series on India's environment challenge and the impact of COVID. We at IIEP have been holding events on India for the last almost year now in this particular series, and for a number of years have held events or series on India's economy, often under the leadership of IIEP Distinguished Visiting Scholar Ajay Chibber, who I'll turn to in just one moment. First, for those of you who are not familiar with the Institute, IIEP is located at the Elliott School at GW and is a cross-school interdisciplinary research center. It aims to serve as a catalyst for high-quality multidisciplinary research in policy issues surrounding economic globalization. That could include trade or finance or development or poverty studies or climate change. And we've also had a bit of a focus on both China's economy and India's economy over a number of years. We've been quite busy at IIEP over the last year with ongoing series on India's economy, this series right here, as well as China's economy, inequality, rethinking capitalism, and multidimensional poverty, as well as a number of other events. I encourage you to go to our website, to the events page. You can see either links to older events if you want to watch the videos, or more importantly, links to the upcoming events as well. I want to thank our student staff at IIEP, without whom nothing could actually take place here. They do really all the work behind the scenes, as well as our operations manager, Kyle Renner, for his partnership and making everything move along here. I also do just want to thank the panelists today and all the guests here. I know this has been a really challenging time in India, and I very much appreciate people coming to talk about such an important issue. And so our thoughts have been with India quite a bit over the last couple of months. And so I want to thank everyone for being able to be here today. With that, I want to turn it over to Ajay.
Thank you very much, Jay, and welcome to all of you. As Jay just said, we started this particular series last year in September, actually after the COVID had already struck. And part of the reasoning for it was, of course, that there was a shutdown, but also we were thinking that we should start looking at India from the perspective of a post-COVID world, where India was already in trouble before COVID hit India. Growth was slowing down, there was huge inequalities. And as many of the reports that our lead speaker today, Sunita, has presented year after year, the environment was deteriorating, air quality was terrible, water quality was terrible, etc. So I think in a way, it's not the best of times, but it is the best of times in a way, because this ninth session in our series is fittingly on COVID, but also on environment and the state of India's environment. And partly also it's important because whenever there's talk of trying to revive the economy, there will be pressure to relax environmental standards in the country. Anyway, we've seen this tragedy now. It's tragedy of errors in India, and there's plenty written about it, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but here we are. We have three very distinguished speakers today to speak on these issues, and I hope this will be, as has been in previous events, a very interactive session. Let me start by first introducing Muthukumar Mani. He's at the World Bank. He leads the climate change practice for South Asia as a whole. He's worked before that at the IMF as well. And while it's not in his CV, he has written a few years back now, but probably one of the most comprehensive reports on India's environment from the World Bank. So it's very good to have you, Mani. And then we have Laveesh Bhandari. You can read more about all of these people in their bios, but I'll just introduce them. Laveesh is a good friend. He's now the head of the climate change at the Center for Social and Economic Progress. But I know Laveesh well before that. He used to produce, along with another friend of mine, Vivek Debroy, who now heads the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, an index on competitiveness across Indian states. And that's when I first got to know him. But in the last 2-3 years, we've been talking more on climate change. Both of us have focused on that. And he produces one of the most interesting bulletins called the Unearth Bulletin. It's worth seeing that. If you haven't seen it, you can Google it. It comes out, I think, once a month, and it produces some of the most interesting stuff that you can find on climate change, not just for India, but also globally as well. And our lead speaker is Sunita Narain. She's the director of the Center for the Science and the Environment, which she started with another very well-known environmentalist called Anil Agarwal. In my view, she has become the face of the environment movement in India with her writing, but her commentary and her columns and her act. She's not only a scholar, but she's also an activist. And for that, she has won many awards. She has the Padma Shri, which is a very high civilian award in India. Time magazine has made her the most influential person of the year. The Swedish government has awarded her the Order of the Polar Star. And lately she has won an award from the city of Edinburgh as well. So I can think of no better person to start this conversation than Sunita. Over to you, Sunita.
Thank you, Ajay, and thank you for such a warm introduction, and thank you, Jay. I'm also delighted to be here with both Mani and Laveesh. Both are good friends, and their work on environment in India is outstanding, and so it's wonderful to be together with colleagues. As Jay said, these are very difficult times in India. And I have to say, when Ajay asked me to do this talk, I could actually focus on environment and climate change challenges. But to be very honest, in today's India, at this current time, when we literally have something called like an apocalypse happening all around us, and even as my city of Delhi, things start getting back to a little bit of normal, and not little bit of normal means death is still high, but yes, we are not hearing of such distress calls as we were last 2 weeks. That's the only better news that we have. But for most of us who live here, every time we pick up our phone and every time we check, there is some bad news around, and there is bad news across. And when you live through these times, as I'm sure many of you did when similar episodes happened in the US, there are two things that happen. One, you tend to believe that everything else that you work on is not important because the horrors of today are just so overwhelming. But on the other hand, the other thing that happens is that you don't want to look at what made this horror what it is. And there's a human tendency to say, let's not discuss the causes. Let's not discuss the fundamental reasons right now. Right now, we just need to talk about how we move ahead. Now, you can only move ahead when you understand the nature of the crisis that has brought you to this. And I think it's very important, therefore, for most of us who live here and for us in the world, because COVID teaches us one thing, that we are an interdependent world. I mean, climate change hit us and we all understood that the emissions in the US are today jeopardizing large parts of India or Bangladesh, and the poor of India are victims of those emissions, of the stock of greenhouse gases in the air. We also understood with climate change that if the US created the problem yesterday, countries like India can create it tomorrow, which means that cooperation is critical in this interdependent world. But that's what COVID has brought back to us. I mean, COVID has taught us some lessons which we need to take forward as we discuss environment, as we discuss climate change. And one of the most critical lessons is to understand, obviously, the whole issue of inclusive growth. I mean, the fact today is that why India is suffering the way it is, or why the United States suffered the way it did, is because of its in India's case, the pathetic nature of our healthcare. In the US, the lack of access or the equity in the availability of healthcare and the scale of the crisis. And clearly for us, the biggest issue today becomes, as we move ahead, is to understand, therefore, how we need to invest in repairing the system, but we need to repair it so that it's affordable and accessible to all. Because that's the second biggest lesson that we learn out of it, is that we need to understand both the interdependence at the global level. We need to understand the interdependence at the national level. Today, it's also a fact that if COVID exists across rural India, as it is today, all data is showing that the positivity rate in rural India is just huge. And remember, the positivity rate is calculated with abysmal number of tests being done. So you probably are undercounting in a very big way the scale of the devastation that is happening all around us as the biggest nightmare. I mean, last year we wrote about this. I wrote about it in my column, that the biggest nightmare for us would be when COVID moves from urban India into rural India. Because at least in urban India, we have some availability of healthcare. But that's the crisis that are hitting us today. But what is also very clear to us is that if you don't deal with the issues of rural India, and the poor, whether it is healthcare or the availability of vaccines, then you are going to make sure that nobody is safe in the country. And I think that's one of the biggest lessons that we are learning. It's the lesson of climate change. It's the lesson of, ironically, air pollution, the issue that I work on the most, which is that even if a part of Delhi will clean up its air, the airshed is one. And if you don't talk about the issue of equity and the need for access to clean energy for all, the need for mobility for all, you will never have the control over air pollution. And that's really what COVID has brought back to us. The fact is today, and the world needs to get its act together on this, not just India. We need to make sure that we have vaccines for all. We cannot afford a vaccine apartheid at all, because we have also learned that this virus, and maybe this virus really has come to us at a time to teach us some very key lessons. And I mean, I'm discounting all the theories that it has come right now from a lab, because the lab wouldn't have designed it so cleverly. I think the natural world is certainly teaching us a lesson or two right now. And one of the lessons that this virus is teaching us, that arrogance will definitely not work when it comes to dealing with this virus. It's like the arrogance of humankind with nature, that you cannot afford to be arrogant with nature. Nature will come back to hit you. When it came to climate change, or when it comes to a cloudburst in the Himalayas, where you see devastation happening, because we as human beings were arrogant enough to believe that we could re-engineer the river, we could build all the dams we wanted, because we had the science of engineering behind us. And we had a very masculine view of the world to believe that we could re-engineer it all. Well, nature teaches us a lesson or two as we move ahead. And that's really what this virus has done. It's teaching us as Indians a very key lesson, that we need to make sure that we have a very high order of governance. We need to make sure that we have a system in which the poorest, the most vulnerable get provided with healthcare. We need to make sure that the vaccine reaches everybody, and it cannot be on the fact that the rich will get vaccinated because they can go to hospitals and the poor do not have it. You have to make sure that you have a system in which you can provide for all. And this, in some senses, Ajay and Jay, and for all your audience, is the key lesson that we have learned when it comes to the state of India's environment. In our reports that we have done year after year, the SOE, as we call it, started way back in 1980 by my colleague Anil Agarwal. And we have continued to do these reports as a state of art, as a state of the environment. And, we publish a fortnightly magazine, Down to Earth, and the report becomes our annual state of art. But one of the biggest lessons that we have learned in this state of art is that the state of the environment is definitely under threat today, and there is no question about it. SOE 2021 puts out data which shows you very clearly whether it's a state of water pollution, whether it's a state of air pollution. We definitely have a crisis that is staring us in the face. And all indicators are showing that in spite of government action, and there is government action, we have a river cleaning program, our water quality, our air quality is getting worse. And the lesson that we learn from this, and I want to reconnect it to the lesson of COVID, is the lesson that we learn from this really is the lesson that as environmentalists based in the South, we cannot afford to take the paradigm of environmental management that we have learned from the already rich countries of the world. Those countries could afford a model in which they could clean up, they could pollute and then clean up. And they always stayed behind the problem. I mean, if they didn't stay behind the problem, then we would not have climate change. Because if you take just the context of, say, air pollution, and you take the context of vehicles, we know that over the last 10 to 15 years, there has been a huge cleaning up in terms of the fuels, fuel quality, as well as in terms of emission standards when it comes to vehicles. Laveesh knows this very well, but we know that the world started off looking at a parameter called suspended particulate matter, and that brought us to clean up the emissions in the vehicles, to clean up the fuel that was used, and to improve technology. But then science caught up, and you found out that no, you cleaned up the fuel, but actually you created a new problem because you removed the size of the particles had gone down. So you ended up with finding that now the particles were so small that you could actually, they would go through your nose. And as I jokingly always say in India, that God invented the nose with hair in it, but he didn't plan for diesel. And so at the end of the day, you get particles which go through your nose. And so science catches up. So technology catches up, investment is put, you clean up the fuel, you clean up your vehicle technology, and you think the problem has gone away. No, because then science finds that no, because in the vehicle design that you had, to get rid of the respirable suspended particulate matter, RSPM, PM 2.5 as it came to be known, you've actually done that by increasing the burning temperature, which means that your NOx levels have gone up. And NOx is an equally dangerous pollutant. So you invest huge amount of money, huge amount of technology, you put a denox catalyst in cars, you clean up NOx, and you think, wow, now I can drive my car and it is the best in the world, as every car company would have advertised and sold to you. But actually not, because now there is more than enough evidence that even as you have cleaned up NOx, you have a problem of the particles getting so small that they could actually go through your skin, or The fact is that transport today contributes the bulk of the greenhouse gas emissions. So the same vehicle that we were spending so much time and effort cleaning up every generation has only meant that we have stayed behind the problem. Today in the US, you have this amazing situation where you have shifted vast parts of your energy infrastructure from coal to gas. You have a 30% reduction in your emissions. And yet in 2019, your absolute emissions were up. Greenhouse gas emissions were up. Carbon dioxide emissions were up because you essentially have transport-related emissions filling in the space, or industry-related emissions filling in the space that was left by the reduction in the energy-related. So transport still is a huge issue. Now think about it from our point of view. We have a crippling problem of air pollution. The only one small thing that COVID did during the lockdown was that we actually saw blue skies. We could see birds, we could hear birds singing instead of the noise of vehicles. It came at a massive cost, and I will talk about it. It's an unsustainable approach to cleaning up the air of Delhi or any other city. But the fact is that we did see blue skies. Now, it basically brought us to the fact to know that if you take vehicles off the road, you will be able to get blue skies and clear lungs. Now, to do that, today we have a situation in which 90% of Delhi's roads are occupied by cars. And those cars commute less than 15% of Delhi's population. So the question of equity comes in, because as you have already overtaken, the cars have overtaken both the airshed as well as the road space, the question becomes, what do we do? Where do we go? And that really, and I can go on and on when it comes to water pollution, I can go on and on with many such examples. But the bottom line of what I want to say to you is that for us, affordability and inclusive growth is critical part of the sustainability challenge. Delhi cannot clean up its air unless it learns to plan for mobility for all. It cannot clean up its air unless there is clean energy systems for all. We cannot think about cleaning up air of our cities unless we have an affordable, inclusive growth model. It's the same thing when it comes to river pollution. I mean, today our rivers are murdered. There's deliberate hydrocide of our rivers. And this is in spite of the fact that government has invested huge amount of money to clean them up. But again, we are following the approach that the rest of the world did, not recognizing our reality. The rest of the world cleaned up its rivers by intercepting the sewage, cleaning up the sewage, and then putting treated water into the river. The fact is, large part of India is not connected to an underground sewage system. Large part of India does not have access to sanitation. Building an underground sewage system is both capital intensive and resource intensive. It will further increase the inequities in our cities. And that is why today you can provide clean water, but you cannot take back the excreta or the shit that comes from households because you don't have the money. You cannot afford the system. Even the richest of the in this country do not pay the price for the shit to be collected, treated, and then put back into the river. We cannot, because the cost is massive. The reality of India is that large part of India is not connected to this system. Then why waste our time following this ridiculous water-based underground flush system approach that the Western world created when it had the money and the resources to do so? Is that the infrastructure dream that we should have? Or should we have a more nimble dream in which we can take our current septic tanks, our current on-site systems, connect them to tankers, take them to treatment plants, but most importantly, learn to reuse both the human excreta as well as the water that comes out of it. So recycle, reuse, rebuild the circular economy that we had. Using the shit that we produce. So I think it's important for us, and the reason I'm saying this is because what COVID teaches us, that it is critical for us. This scale of disruption should for once shake us out of our complacency, should shake us enough to say we need to do things differently. And this is where there are also opportunities. Let me take the one opportunity that we can see in India. One of the biggest opportunities we see is massive migration from our cities back to rural India. Now, last year, when this exodus of very large numbers of people happened from our cities, what became clear to most of us who lived in urban India is that actually there were these invisible people that we had never cared for, we had never planned for. We do not have healthcare for them. We do not have housing for them. We do not have water for them. We do not have sanitation for them. And yet they were critical in terms of providing the well-being and the economic wealth that we have in our cities. Now, these people, seeing the impact on COVID and seeing the fact that there was really no space for them in the cities, have left, came back, and have again left. Now, this is really the opportunity there is to be able to think about the future of work in our country and the future of production. Now, just think about it. Just think about it for one moment. Why do we have the environment or the climate crisis that stares us in the face today? We have this crisis because of the system of, and I hate using these big terms because they kind of but forgive me for a moment, I don't have a better term to use. So I will call it the system of globalization that we stitched together in the early 90s. Interestingly, the same time when the world talked about a climate change agreement in 1992, we were also coming together to build a free trade agreement across the world. Now, what has that done? I mean, I'm old enough to know that at that time, one of your I think he was at the World Bank at that time, Money, and later became head of a big university in the US, had made this, what sounded like such an atrocious statement to say, let's move all our production to countries of the South because it's so much easier, cheaper to do that there. And we all thought, how can you dump the dirt of your countries into our part of the world? But frankly, that has happened. I mean, I visited a year ago one of the colonies outside in the outskirts of Delhi, because the High Court asked me to do so. The High Court said that there was very large case of pollution coming from that colony, where there was blue dye all over the rivers and flowing into the Yamuna. And the High Court wanted me to investigate and see what could be done. Now, what came out very clearly in that visit of mine was the way we have discounted the cost of labor and discounted the cost of environment in this globalization model. So most of Delhi does not want to have polluting industries in its backyard. So we have shifted them to what is an unauthorized area in the city where they continue to operate, because there they do not have to pay for the regulatory cost of environment or for the labor costs that would exist. Now that's exactly what has happened across the world. So we have discounted the cost of environment, we have discounted the cost of labor, we have pushed production to parts of the world where none of this matters. And in my city, we have put it to parts of Delhi where it doesn't matter. And that's happening across. So even if Delhi stops it in its area, ironically, in this place, what I found was that because of the High Court direction, actually the the gate that was opening into Delhi, the factory was shut. But when I went there, I could see the blue dye coming out. And so I asked, but if the factory is shut, where is this blue color coming from? And I was given this very sheepish response to say, yes, Delhi has shut the factory, but the other side of the factory, the door opens in the state of UP, which has not shut it. So the industry had simply closed the door on the side of Delhi and opened it on the side of UP where there was no regulation. Now, that's really the scheme of things which has driven labor to our cities. Now, if you are getting this reverse migration, it needs to be understood that this is an opportunity. Because with climate change, we will see more devastation. We are already beginning to see massive changes because of climate change. Every weather event is becoming one that breaks the back of it's the last straw on the camel's back. And we are seeing intensification of cyclones. We are seeing more weird weather events happening. I mean, the Indian monsoon is our true finance minister. Mrs. Sitaraman, who sits on the chair, or Ajay Chibbar, who was at any point thought that he was involved with India's economics, you are not important. The only entity which is important in India's economic system is the Indian monsoon. That's the true finance minister of our country. And when the finance minister, which is the Indian monsoon, has a problem because of climate change, we're beginning to see more extremes happen, more rain in fewer number of rainy days. And in a country like India, which gets rain only for 100 hours in a year, we will see now more rain in fewer number of rainy days. And we are beginning to see that, which means more floods, more droughts. Now, this is what is really driving out people with the agrarian distress that is happening. This is the double whammy that is happening because of climate change. Now, with people going back to the villages, here is an opportunity to reinvest, to build the resilience in rural India, to think about doing business differently, not to think about an economic structure in which agriculture, people will leave agriculture, that you will see rural India move to urban India, that you will see an economic model which is more driven by services or manufacturing. You could actually think of a different model of economic growth in which every tree, every bamboo bush could become the basis of economic well-being, but as local as possible, as decentralized as possible, in a way that you could actually invest back into building not just well-being, but resilience. And if you look at it, one of the schemes started during the UPA time and continued in the current government is the employment guarantee scheme, Manrega as it is called. It's a scheme which invests into rebuilding the ecological capital in our villages. Unfortunately, the scheme has only been seen from an employment point of view, not from the point of view of being a scheme which actually invests in the sustainability and the durability of the asset that we are creating. But if we do that, look at the kind of transformation that is possible. Our magazine Down to Earth this March actually went back to 16 villages in 15 districts of India. These villages had done rainwater harvesting since 2006. They were the original villages of Manrega. We tracked them back to understand what has been the change in the village because of the work that they did to invest in the ecological capital in the village. And it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible, the stories that you get back of how well-being was increased, how reverse migration was stopped, how girls went to school. I mean, everything. So you have a huge opportunity here to think about, but you need to think out of the box. You need to think at scale, and you need to think in a way that you're not building a delivery system which is from the top to the bottom. You're also not thinking about it as a beneficiary asset creation system. You have to think about it as a system in which you're building the resilience and investing in the well-being of the economy, because it is the local economy. And that's really where you come to when it comes to the urban economy. Because if you can actually make sure that you have lesser number of workers in urban India, and that you can actually stop the migration, which should happen only because people want to leave, not because they're being pushed out to leave. You can actually think of a situation which happened sometime last year during COVID, was when factories were not getting workers, and they were actually flying people down from their villages back to the factories. That government has been talking about creating affordable housing schemes for the workers, because the first time there is a recognition that if people will live in urban India, and they will need to have security of housing, of water, of sanitation, of livability. And that changes the whole character of the urban Indian landscape that we need to create. But it does something even more important. It basically raises the cost of production. Because if you invest so massively in creating the well-being of your workers, then you have to make sure that your cost of production goes up. I mean, when you and any one of us have traveled to factories which have discounted the cost of labor or environment, they will invariably tell you they do that because they have to compete. They have to compete either with factories like this one in UP, or they have to compete with Bangladesh or with China or somewhere else where the costs are discounted. So this really gives you an opportunity to rethink the future of work, the future of production, and then therefore the future of consumption. Because at the core of the climate change issue is consumption. And a consumption-led society cannot fix climate change, the apocalypse, the catastrophe of climate change which awaits us. So if we think that we have seen disruption because of COVID, we don't know what's coming in this post-COVID world when it comes to climate change. So that's really what I thought I would share with you. I hope that makes some sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sunita. That was really, that was quite a talk. Thank you very much. There are a lot of really inspiring things you said in there. I'd like to turn it over to our first discussant, Laveesh. Please, the floor is yours.
That's very unfair of you to ask me to go right after that passionate and really exciting discourse by the person who's actually been the lone warrior for years, on speaking on behalf of the Indian environment, on environmentalists, on policies. And it's really amazing that the work that Sunita has done. And I'm really grateful to you, Jay, and Ajay, to have me on the same panel. Thank you. I'm going to obviously not try to comment on the range of things that Sunita has talked about, but I'd like to just try and identify where is this problem coming from. And yes, there is a massive market failure. As an economist, that's the first thing that we learn. I mean, there's an environmental problem, it's a market failure. There is a massive governance failure in India. It's across the world, but I believe it's more so in India. And I believe what COVID has taught us is there's a sequence of institutional failures. So now if you're living in a country which is soon going to be the world's most populated country, in a region which is going to be most affected by climate change, is already amongst not amongst the richest countries and amongst the not so well-off countries, with a highly exploited environment, then where do you start from? I mean, and that is the question which I've grappled with. And of course, to me, the answer lies in the institutions, that you have to somehow correct institutions, but how do you start correcting them? And that's where I'll step back a bit. And I think India needs to learn a lot from the US. I first came to the US in the late 80s. And since then, I've interacted and been in touch with a lot of my friends are there. And every time I used to tell my friends in the US the same thing, that never underestimate the United States, because in this country, change is inbuilt in your DNA. It's very easy for the US to change things. At least that was my perspective coming from India, where actually change takes so much longer. It's far more dirtier. There's too much back and forth and so on. So somehow we need to figure out how do we build into our own governance mechanisms the ability to change with the times, which change with technologies, change with greater learnings and so on, which frankly we are really, really bad at. So I'll just start with a few examples, right? And what COVID has taught us. And the classic and the worst of the lot. You had a pharma setup of a set of pharmaceutical companies which were exporting to the world, which had massive abilities, had already tied up or had in-house R&D facilities for the vaccine and were producing vaccines. And as of the latter part of last year, were ready to start supplying to India and to the world. So you have all the underlying factors that are there going in your favor. And what India did was it never invested in what it had. So we never ramped up capacity. We refused to pay them to build their own capacities. We refused to agree on a price, so they could not go into the debt markets and borrow money to invest. The government refused to place long-term orders on those vaccines, and we just let a beautiful opportunity go. Now, it's not. I'm not saying it is this government's fault. It is essentially a mindset that you cannot tie up with the private sector. The private sector stands for profit and they're exploitators. And so therefore you can't do that. And we let a beautiful opportunity, just let it through, right? So that to me is just one example of a governance failure where you are unable to understand how to interact with a very rich private manufacturing sector, in this particular case, private services sector, just the whole for-profit sector. That's one example. On the governance side, it's not that India does not have epidemiologists. It's not that we didn't know about many things, but somehow we did not listen to our experts. Now, this is really critical because our experts have been talking about the environment for the last 50 years. Sunita has been at it for at least 30 years, right? I mean, I haven't checked the first date of your writing. So, but we just do not listen. Now, if you're not going to listen to the expertise that is available in the country, listen to the expertise that's global. But we somehow haven't been doing that. So what we did not do in the case of COVID, we haven't been doing in the case of the environment. So that's something that we know is a classic problem, that we are unable to work with the private sector. We are unable to listen to the expertise, which is there within our government. Forget about outside. Even within the government, there's a lot of expertise. So that's the second part. And the third part, which I think is the critical, the core problem, which COVID has revealed is happening in the environment space. To me, it is that the people are not loyal to their professions. And I'll just talk about this. I mean, COVID failure. We have our parallel to the CDC in the US, right? We have that. No one spoke out. No one said that the government or the state governments, or forget about talking about a prime minister, the various chief ministers or various government bodies, no one had a press conference saying that you need to be doing this and you're not doing this. So what seems is that Indians, when they are working within institutions in India, are not as loyal to their professions as they are when they are working abroad. That's another kind of an institutional failure. So I feel that there are these institutional failures that are coming in from certain weaknesses which we have built up ourselves, but we will need to correct it. To correct it, I feel that we really need to understand how your institutions work, because let's face it, there have been many big challenges that the US has faced, but people have spoken. They have actually put their careers on the line and spoken out, but we haven't. I think that is a really critical difference, which somehow we need to build in our country to be able to manage what's coming ahead. And Sunita is absolutely right. This is not even the tip of the iceberg. What we have seen is really just a small indication, a few data points of what is coming ahead. We don't realize that the population of India is going to increase by about 3 to 400 million over the next few decades. We already are a very dense population. Our rivers are stretched, our forests are stretched, our farms are stretched, our soil is stretched, our water resources are stretched. And we don't know how to manage any of these because our governance mechanisms are stretched. So obviously, as always happens, somehow it's a hugely resilient country. And again, the COVID has revealed that to the world, not just to ourselves. Massively resilient. So we'll manage this for sure. The question is, how well can we do that? And the best way to do that is to start building our institutions right now. People need to stand up in our pollution control boards, and there are quite a few of them at the state level, at the national level. People need to stand up within the government technocracy, informing the political powers that there are these challenges that you need to address now. And most important of all, the economics, as Sunita alluded to, has failed. I mean, the liberal economics is not going to carry us over the next 30 or 40 years, leave alone for the next century. We need to be addressing that. But I will not have that solution. You may not have that solution. That solution will come from the institutions. It's not going to be just one person writes a new book and that's the answer. That doesn't happen. It's going to be our governance mechanism, institutional mechanisms, how we deal with the private sector, how we discipline our public sector, which, by the way, is the most polluting entity in India today. So there are all of these challenges that we need to address. And I feel, and I'll stop here, I feel that we have a lot to learn from the Western world. And the learning is not the technology, not the assets that you have, not your money. No, none of that. Essentially, how you need to be loyal to your professions. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That was terrific. I want to turn now to our second discussant. But before I do, just to let everyone know that shortly the chat will be opening up. So people in the audience who have questions, please, when that's open, you can put them in the chat and I'll bring those to the full panel afterwards. So Muthukumar, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jay. Good morning, everyone in DC, and good evening to everyone back in India. First, I would like to start with a prayer to those who are still going through a great deal of hardship back home because of the pandemic. The news continues to be grim, and there have been no one who has been left untouched by COVID-19 one way or the other through family or friends. Thanks again to Ajay for this opportunity to be a panelist in this esteemed forum. It's always fascinating to listen to Sunita, and as Laveesh mentioned, hard act to follow, and even more fascinating to read her writings. I've been a consumer of the State of the Environment reports, which consistently present evidence on the challenges that we face, from air pollution to natural resource degradation to climate change. And I believe the latest version is particularly fascinating in that it's not only been produced in the middle of the pandemic, but also brings together 60 or so distinguished environmental scholars from the country. So we are still in the middle of the pandemic. So the question is, are there any silver linings that we can learn from? I think first and foremost, it has given us a glimpse, as Sunita and Laveesh mentioned, what the climate-induced catastrophe could mean to us, especially in terms of the tail-end risks. But it has further demonstrated the importance of science and data-driven policy, especially if you compare the two US administration, you can really see it makes a huge difference. It has given us a reason to strengthen our healthcare delivery systems, or it has highlighted, as in the case of India, how broken the health system is in dealing with a crisis of this nature. It has highlighted the importance of and the need for strong social safety nets to deal with a crisis situation like this. The good news is there's been more emphasis on social hygiene, like hand washing and wearing masks, I think, which will serve us well in the future. It has given us a very brief glimpse of what clean water and blue skies actually will look like if we do things right, and also the tenuous links between human and animals, or humans and nature. Many would argue that this should be taken as a wake-up call. We should start planning for a post-pandemic recovery that's green and resilient. It's all well and good. Building back better is the new mantra everywhere. But first of all, we should realize, as Sunita was mentioning, we are still not out of the pandemic to talk about a resilient recovery, especially in India. Our focus should continue to remain on health services delivery to deal with the crisis, and also to ensure that large chunk of the population gets vaccinated. The focus then should shift to providing food and jobs to the people who have lost their livelihoods and their family as well. Once we are done with taking care of health and jobs, and then the focus obviously should shift to macroeconomic recovery or macroeconomic stabilization. Clearly, the fiscal is in shambles. And there's a need to stimulate growth, especially given that we still have huge slither of the population in poverty. So given all these constraints, the government now will need to look at ways to stimulate the economy, either through their spending policies, or stimulus packages, or monetary easing. And that's where I guess the whole concept of green recovery and building back better fits in. India's stimulus packages were not particularly green. In fact, they were actually regressive in the sense that India opened up the coal mining even to the private sector in the middle of the pandemic. In case of Pakistan, on the other hand, they actually had a billion tsunamis program where they decided to plant a billion trees so as to provide jobs and livelihoods to people. But then these types of kind of green initiatives, one sometimes can call as the low-hanging fruits. They provide short-term relief in terms of jobs and environmental benefits, but they don't provide long-term growth benefits. About 6 years ago, as Ajay was mentioning, I wrote a book called Greening India's Growth. At that time, India was one of the fastest growing large economies in the world, growing at about 7 to 8%, and constantly being compared to China. And main concern at that time was how are we going to manage the environmental aspects of this rapid economic growth. Growth is no longer an issue, unfortunately, but environmental concerns remain, as Sunita and Laveesh mentioned. Air pollution continues to be a major challenge in the country, may even have exacerbated the COVID impacts. Although we have made some progress in sanitation through the Swachh Bharat campaign, water quality continues to be of major concern, and so is water security. Climate change remains a major peril for the country, be it the glacier melt or the sea level rise, or the extreme flooding events or the droughts that we face throughout the country. But as Sunita was mentioning, this is a big agenda, and we need for a more strategic approach to deal with this once the pandemic is behind us. Just to give you an example, as Sunita was also mentioning, about 50% or even more than 50% of the air pollution in Delhi comes from outside of Delhi. And not only the neighboring states, but even beyond. So Delhi alone cannot solve its air pollution problem. And they realized it very quickly in China during the Beijing Olympics. They tried to shut down the entire city of Beijing, hoping that pollution will come down, only to realize that much of the pollution in Beijing actually came from outside of Beijing. So they have now taken a more of a regional approach, or what is called an airshed approach. Therefore, city by city approach that's being promoted in the National Clean Air Program in India is suboptimal and needs to be revisited. And it calls for a more of an airshed or a regional approach and regional cooperation. And we all know how pollution levels in India, in Delhi, peak during the crop residue burning in Punjab and Haryana. So having said that, if one were to plan for a green recovery post the pandemic, we must ask ourselves a few questions in terms of what is the degree of complementarity between short-term macroeconomic goals, because the priority is now growth and employment versus long-term environmental and natural resource growth benefits? Or what is the degree of complementarity between investments that most enhance long-term growth prospect versus environmental costs and benefits? So if we were to go the green recovery route, we need to actually look at each policy that the government is proposing, and then they need to be judged on the basis of this metric. Is it going to create growth? At the same time, will it also create environmental benefits? So to conclude, where do we go from here? As I mentioned, I think the priority right now in India should be on health and health alone. We need to make sure that healthcare services delivery is taken care of and people get vaccinated. Then focus then should shift to jobs and livelihoods. As Sunita was mentioning, millions of people, migrants are all over the place now, and they need jobs, they need food. So clearly that should be the next big agenda item for the government. But once we are done with this, once we are trying to come out of this, obviously the economy will be in shambles. So clearly the macroeconomic situation, the fiscal situation need to be revived so that the growth takes off once again. So if you had the IMF, the traditional kind of macro fiscal reform package would include things like expanding the tax base, improving the tax administration systems, easing of monetary policy, streamlining of current and capital expenditure, making your exchange rate more flexible, improving the investment climate, and so on and so forth, the standard kind of the so-called Washington consensus prescriptions. But I would like to turn this around and say, yes, that's well and good, but maybe this is an opportunity also to revisit our structural agenda, what I would like to call the unfinished structural reform agenda. Maybe this is the right time to start talking about agricultural subsidy reforms. Maybe this is the right time to start talking about electricity pricing or fossil fuel subsidies. Maybe this is the right time to talk about water pricing or more fiscal devolution to local bodies so that they can better handle climate disasters. Maybe this is a good time to talk about insurance, crop insurance, or carbon taxes, or environmental taxes, or bringing in more sovereign wealth fund or pension funds to deal with climate resilience. So maybe this is a time to open up our structural agenda, which we have not addressed in a long time. I know the situation is not right. Even a small measure that the government of India tried to do with agricultural policy majorly backfired. And so clearly this is going to be sensitive. But again, we cannot keep putting this behind us and just focus on the standard macroeconomic policies package that we often go to stimulate the economy. So clearly, I believe that if we actually reopen the structural reform agenda, that will not only help in terms of generating revenue for the economy, especially if you start talking about environmental taxes, removing subsidies, and so on and so forth, but also it will have the double kind of win-win in terms of environmental benefits as well. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Those all three were really fascinating starts to a conversation. What I'd like to do now is turn it back over to Sunita for any reactions, and then I'd like to also encourage the audience to please go ahead and put any questions you have in the chat, and I'll bring those forward to everyone after we hear from Sunita. Sunita, please.
Jay, not really. I mean, both Mani as well as Laveesh have really taken forward many of the points that we have made. I think, you know, if I was just to reiterate some of the points that they have made in terms of the future going ahead, I think one, as Laveesh very clearly said, it is really about institutions and about rebuilding institutions and reinvesting in public institutions. And I think that's one of the lessons that we in the environmental movement have been talking about for a long time now, that we really cannot plan on governance systems which negate undermine and weaken the public institutional fabric. I mean, if you take the environmental issues that we look at, one of the biggest problems is the lack of scrutiny, the lack of transparency, the lack of institutional capability to be able to manage even pollution, the lack of deterrence that exists when it comes to being able to hold polluters responsible. So I think the rebuilding of the public institutional capacities is going to be very critical. And this is important, as I'm sure in the US you have also learned, is that for too long the world has really not invested in the public institutions. And I think that compact between the public and the private and the citizen has to be rebuilt. And the role of public institutions is critical when it comes to environment, when it comes to COVID, when it comes to the economy. I mean, I do a lot of work on food safety, and one of the scandal after scandal in food safety exists because we have given away so much control of our food to the food manufacturing system. And that really requires us to rebuild the institutional capacity. The second thing I think that comes out, which Laveesh talked about, and I want to reiterate, is the role of science and experts. And I think, over the last 10 years, you have seen how across the world, the role of science and experts has been treated as being elitist. It has been disregarded. It has been mocked upon even. And what COVID has taught us is that we need to listen to science. I mean, a very simple thing when it came to the US. I mean, your lack of direction in terms of whether you need to wear a mask or not. I think something so simple. Do we wear a mask? How do we wear a mask? And yet today that is becoming the biggest weapon against COVID. And so the role of science, and this is everyday science which is really now part of our everyday lives. The role of science in rebuilding the role of expert information in policy making. I mean, in India, we keep saying we are knowledge proof. Our policy making systems have become increasingly knowledge proof. And I think that's really where we need to understand that is critical. But that also means that we need a new scientific institutional system. The academic scientific system today is so fossilized, and I'm not even going to talk about how masculine and male it is. I'm not even going to talk about that, but it's so fossilized, it's so inward looking, it feeds on itself rather than it has no responsibility to the public. I mean, in all the campaigns that we have worked on, whether it has been air pollution, diesel, Coca-Cola, pesticides, every one of the campaigns, our biggest problem has been the scientific establishment and their inability to be able to move, to be able to connect to issues, and to be able to speak out. And I think therefore the need for science to become part of public policy and discourse is critical. And the third thing, when I look at what Mani is saying, I'm sorry, Mani, I think the solutions you're offering are of yesterday's world. And I think they are not the restructuring that we require in today. The green restructuring we require are far more fundamental and I really would request the World Bank and IMF to get out of these glib words of sort of, tax versus subsidy and, let's start pricing water. I mean, all the talk about pricing water, have you understood what it's like to price water and sewage together? What will be the cost of it? What will be the need to be able to for people to be able to use it? So I think we need to move beyond these words, these cliches that we have sort of adopted, and we need to move much beyond it in the current system. are opportunities. I think there are ideas out there. And I think we need to be not elephants, but ants, to be able to be far more nimble, to get these ideas and adopt them in today's world. Because I think that's really where I think the nature of the crisis is going to lead us. But I totally agree with Mani when he says invest in health, invest in health. And I think one of the most interesting things that the government of India did in this last budget 2021 was to include water supply as part of the health budget component. Now, I think that's also one of the biggest issues that we need to recognize, how health is also about prevention, not just healthcare. And that's where the air pollution agenda, the water pollution agenda, the issue of garbage, of sanitation, all those issues need to get integrated into the health agenda, because we are too poor a country to cure people after they have the disease. We have a double burden, whether it is the rich and the poor, whether it's obesity and malnutrition. So we need to find ways in which we can fix our food system so that we do not first create problems of obesity as well as food production systems. So I think the preventive agenda becomes the driving force for the change. And I think that's the lingo and the jargon and the approach that we need to take, rather than, and get out of these sort of macroeconomic buzzwords of tax, subsidy, price. I mean, you can price carbon, we've priced coal, and yet today you have a government which has derailed the clean thermal power standards. So, there's a lot more that we need to do other than this. And last thing, Jay, last thing. The one approach that we need to really take is, how do we empower local communities, decentralize and strengthen democracy? And the reason I say this from an environmental point of view is that the most powerful notion in the world has been the NIMBY poor, not in my backyard. And that is why the backyard has always become the backyard of the poor. But if the poor become strong, empowered, critical, then they start saying, not in my backyard. And that means that the rich have to reinvent their ways of doing things. And I think that's what, to me, are some of those triggers for change. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to come to a couple of the questions from the chat. And one that had occurred to me, Laveesh, when you were talking, was you talked about the US being able to change quickly. And I was struck by that, because when political scientists compare, say, the US and Europe, they often talk about a presidential system having lots of checks and balances and actually not being able to move quickly, and that the US can't take these huge shifts. And one of the questions in the chat from Sunita Sharma also pointed out that even in the US, we have seen, in some sense, very, very politically divisive response to systemic challenges, whether it's the pandemic or climate change. And so I guess the question he's asking, and I would also ask, is, are there specific political changes that really any of the three of you think are necessary to make India better able to move, especially when we consider that, looking around the world, many countries seem to have problems of responding in any way to these systemic challenges. I don't know if Laveesh, if you want to start, but then either Mani or Sunita hopping in.
Yeah, I do feel some level of changes are required, but I don't think it has to do with changing from a to a presidential form of government. I don't think that will change anything really. I think what's really critical is greater decentralization of some of the powers, which essentially the Indian constitution still tends to follow at a very basic a colonial style of power allocation. So I think we do need to get into a more disaggregated mode. And one really important part of that is actually, for the cities at least, a mayoral form of government at the city level, where you have empowered mayors who can actually take decisions for their cities. which is right now not happening in India. But that's at a very decentralized, that's just one example of a decentralization thing that we need to do. When I was talking about change being built in, it's not really about the kind of government that you have. It's actually, I see it more as a social issue that people are open to change much more than you see in India. Now, I'm not a political economist or a political scientist, but I've always felt that whenever I go to the US, there are all of these challenges that people are like worrying about. And I always say the same thing, give it 3 years and you will see a massive difference. And it happens. You come to India and you say, there's all of these challenges that we worry about. You give it 10 years and you're still worrying about the same challenges. There is clearly a major difference in the way how quickly your society changes from the way ours does. So that's all that I was talking about. And I don't think changing to a presidential will really make any difference in India.
Sunita or Mani, any other comments on specifically what types of shifts you think are necessary?
Can I come in there? Laveesh, as in climate change activist, I think the US does not change fast enough. Okay, so please let's not I mean, yes, it's a highly educated society. It has strong institutions. And when it can change its government, it can also make sure that it has better governance systems in place. But I am sorry, Laveesh, today the biggest crisis in the world is created by the US and the US addiction to cheap fuel. Let's please understand the implication of this for the rest of the world. So let's not, I mean, I'm sorry, I know I'm speaking to friends in the US, but I hope you'll forgive me when I say this, that your model and your system of growth has really created a problem for the rest of us because we emulate it. And, you know, it's widely said one American, the lifestyle of one American would blow us. You know, there's no way a planet could afford it. We'll need many, many planets. But the fact is, it's also aspirational. And the fact is, if you compare even the US per capita emissions to Europe and the fact that the US is moving so slowly. I mean, Washington, the city where Ajay and Jay are today, is one of the most broken cities when it comes to public transport. US government data itself shows that 90% of the people in Washington commute to work using a private car. This is not the same in New York, but it is in Washington. And when I have had the temerity to tell my friends in the US that if you're planning a bus rapid transit system in Delhi, why don't you talk about it for Washington? I am told, oh, it'll never work here. It'll never be possible. So I think it's important for us in this today's world, we are all in it together and we're as good or as bad as each other. So I think one of the lessons I take back as an environmentalist is do not preach to each other, do not look down upon each other, do not look up to each other. Just learn to be humble and listen and learn, and maybe in that we will not have a conversation of the deaf and the dumb.
Manny, anything to add?
Yeah, I would like to, I think, go back to Laveesh's point about institutional failure. I think basically there are three parts to environmental crisis, right? One is the market failure, the other is the policy failure, and then of course institutional failure. Now what's happening in India's context is when institutions fail, the judiciary takes over. Even now during the COVID crisis, it's the High Court and the Supreme Court that's asking people, the government to vaccinate people, to follow the social protocols and so on and so forth, which should not be judiciary's role. I think Laveesh had a good point in the sense that I think if you have strong institutions, then there's no for judicial activism, which is what's happening, be it COVID, be it environment. Just wanted to also come back to Sunita's points about, us the economists or the World Bank people always talking about taxes and expenditure, but I think at the center of it, I think we know that the ministries of environment, which has been managing environmental issues for decades, they have failed miserably, be it US, be it India. And now, at the end of the day, the ministries of finance are responsible for running their country. And I think we should bring it to their attention that environmental crisis is also an economic crisis. And the only language that they understand, of course, is taxes and expenditures. So clearly, I think if you want to correct policy failures like fossil fuel subsidies or market failures like not pricing pollution, clearly, I think we need to actually talk the language of ministries of finance, because ministries of environment really have failed us.
Great, thank you. I want to turn to Ajay Chibber for a question now.
I was just going to fill in case there weren't questions, but just since you've given me the floor, let me just say that, I mean, the way I look at it, yes, it's a massive institutional failure, but it's not a Ministry of Environment versus a Ministry of Finance approach. It's probably a whole of government, and I think Sunita is right. It's a whole of society, or Laveesh was saying, whole of society approach that is needed to tackle something of this magnitude. That said, I think the role of government is important, and the role of government institutions is important in providing at least some sort of a framework. And in India, my feeling is that there is I'm just going to put out what I think, and then pass it back to you as a question, is that the government is involved in so many things and doing them all so badly. And that's partly why we have only roughly 1% of spending on health. That if the government were to be much more concentrated on getting a few things done which it is supposed to better, like health and education and environment, and the things that require the kind of basic public collective action, and then leave running of businesses and all these public enterprises that we have in India to the private sector, I mean, we would have a much better set of outcomes for the economy, for the environment, for a whole sort of issue. So I just wanted to put that back to you in that way, that it is a whole of society approach, but then the role of government becomes quite important in setting it up in a way that can be made to work. And if any reactions to that, to maybe Sunita or anybody. Yeah, Laveesh has his hand up.
I think Laveesh will be better at it. My view is that I need more government. I need more public institutions. You can get them out of running businesses for all I care. But the fact is we have to invest in public institutions, and a new breed of public institutions which have enormous power and ability to be able to govern independently. But Laveesh?
So I mean, that's something that I think there's more or less a consensus on the out here, that we do need to invest more in our public institutions. The problem that happens is that when we start to say that, well, the whole society needs to change, or then everything needs to change, then effectively we are saying nothing is going to change, because these kind of changes don't ever happen. A lot of these changes that happen within the governance mechanisms, as has happened everywhere else in the world, are fairly organic. They happen over a period of time. One thing leads to another, and so on. And that's where, and Sunita, you got me there on the environment thing, by the way, absolutely. But I would still like to say that, in having the ability to change institutions is so critical within any society. And that is what we need to somehow get, because we are not going to change all the institution in one go. We are not going to get that amazing prime minister who's going to say, okay, fine, I'm going to do this and nothing else. No, that's not going to happen. But how do we change one institution after another in some sort of an organic way? I think that is the critical question. But it has happened in other countries. They may have taken 50 years or 100 years. We may have to do it in 10 years or 20 years. The fact is, it has happened. And somehow we need to figure out how to build that in. Yeah.
Jay, if I may quickly
Yep.
respond to this, I think it really is about strengthening democracy. And it's not cliche, Laveesh. It can be and must be done. I mean, you have got increased, we've never built the institutions at the village or at the city level. And today the irony of India is that the modern cities that are coming up, the new cities that are coming up, are run by authorities which are headed by bureaucrats, and that we have actually made sure that the municipal systems and their governance was never put into the hands of institutions which could be at scale and could actually make sure that they could invest back. And I think that's really where the institutional agenda for India is, that we need to strengthen those institutions. And I think COVID provides us the opportunity where there is now talk about, I mean, for the first time, we are seeing these scary pictures out of rural India. And I mean, I'm beginning to hear, I mean, the unfortunate thing is, I don't know if it'll last over for a while, but we're beginning to hear, why haven't we invested in the rural health infrastructure? We know why we have not, but we need to. And I think that's really, to me, where the change will come. And I think the more we put, democracy is an amazing thing. And I think we need to invest in it and believe in it. I do tremendously.
So one that takes us to one of the first questions that came in the chat to me was the question asked, how can we actually improve democracy and governance institutions with the very, very strong cleavages by caste and class and religion in India? How do you get past those barriers? And maybe connected, since we've only got about 5 minutes left, would be, you could also weave in the last question, which touches on this as well, which is, what would a feasible decentralization look like? What would you act like? It's one thing to say we need to devolve the power or decentralize, but what does that actually look like? Maybe we could start with Sunita, and then each of the panelists could hop in if they'd like.
I think decentralization is about believing in people's ability to take decisions. And you will have to make sure that you take these glasses of caste, class out of it, because at the end of the day, when you give people the power to take those decisions, they do take them for all. And I think because they have to coexist, and you've seen that again and again and again, that yes, there will be violent parts of North India. I mean, forget certain parts of UP and Bihar. All of India is not UP and Bihar. There are many other parts of India that exist. So let's sort of, let's not take just those really bad, really those places where you see men with guns shooting down everybody, and you feel, in that caste violence system, how can you talk about decentralization? And as a result of it, what we have done is to give more and more powers to the bureaucracy to fix everything, because we have said they will be the neutral umpires over how people will decide. We, look at Kerala. Kerala has an incredible decentralized system. Today, just as an aside, most of the Mallus, the Malayalis in Delhi are running back to Kerala, even though Kerala has very high positivity rate, very high infection rate. Yet they know that they will not run out of oxygen. They will get healthcare in their village. There will be a system of community management of medicines that will happen. And the Kerala health minister won this last election with the greatest majority in a state which is still being ravaged by infection. So ironically, you would think that if she was the health minister of a state where the infections were high, she should have lost. But she won because there is trust there. People believe that the government is actually working to fix things. And you've created a decentralized system. I mean, in my world, Jay, one of the most fascinating examples always comes, which I give when I talk about waste management, something very mundane, I'm sure, for garbage management is, in Kerala, because you have such a politicized polity, or you have an empowered, educated polity, outside the cities, particularly the capital city, Thiruvananthapuram, villages outside have said, we will not allow you to dump your solid waste in our village, not in my backyard. Now, the city of Trivandrum now has no place to send its waste. As a result of it, it's had to compost, it's had to segregate, it's had to plan on recycling because it has no place to dump its waste. And I think that's really, to me, where the change comes, where you have to invest, and you have to invest in the institutions at the village level. UPA did a lot to talk about decentralization. There was a time when we had an opportunity, but the UPA government talked about the form and not the investment in the institutions of people that matter. So at the end of the day, if you look at the money that went into building the institutions, it was just too little. So we need to do that. And I hope that in the coming years, there will be a greater sense that that's the only way to go.
Great. Laveesh or Manny?
Okay, so very quickly, so I agree with Sunita that decentralization is the way to go, and it's really, really critical that we do that, and that will happen through institutions. The one really important part of that is a free press. It seems to have taken a few hits recently, but you know, it's not something that today, in this day and age, that I can expect any government to control the press or the media for too long. I don't think it's feasible. So I think that's something that goes for India. I also believe that something that we don't appreciate fully is a very complex and a very sophisticated way of conflict resolution that is there in India. It's very informal. You cannot have a country like India being governed without a very sophisticated, nuanced method of conflict resolution. And that actually is what holds us all together. And that's something which I think also helps address a lot of the internal problems related to caste, religion, etc., etc., etc. So I think there are some things going. Most important, we do need to decentralize. And for that, I think it is civil society, global pressure, whatever, I mean, of Indians abroad, within India. I think all of this will help in this process.
Yes, quickly on decentralization, it's easy to do, decentralization through a constitutional amendment saying that, look, you guys states, you now take care of environment, you take care of water, you take care of urban waste. But I think the problem comes that the resources are not there. So unless you do a fiscal decentralization along with the actual decentralization, I think the state still will be hampered in doing things. And as long as you are still relying on the federal government or central government for transfer of resources, I think as long as that is there, I think decentralization will only remain on paper.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and have a good rest of your day or good evening, depending where you are. So thanks everyone.